Today we're going to try and find out which of the Sigma art lenses that cover the 24 to 35mm range performs best for video and for photo, as well as adapted and speed boosted. Oh, and I'm shooting this video right now using the winning lens. Let's get undone. Gerald Undone. He's crazy. What's happening, everybody? I'm Gerald Undone, and for relaxing times, make it Suntory time. So I do a lot of shooting in the 24 to 35mm range, and I love Sigma lenses, but I've never had all of their lenses that cover that range at the same time. But as I announced in my social posts earlier this week, I do now. By the way, if you're not following me on Instagram or Twitter, I highly suggest that you do so that you can see those little sneak peeks and behind the scenes on upcoming videos and get your votes in for tests that you want me to run. Alright, so for today's test, we've got the 24 and 35mm f1.4 primes, we've got the 24 to 35mm f2 zoom for full frame, and the 18 to 35mm f1.8 crop zoom. I didn't include the 28mm in this roundup because that lens is in a different class and price point, and I don't really think would be fair to compare it. It's of the same caliber of that 40mm Sigma Monster that I reviewed a little while ago, and I highly recommend you watch that video if you want to know what you get for 50% more money in those newer Sigma lenses. But for this video, we're just going to be sticking to the lenses that fit in the same price and performance ratio. The format for today's video is just going to be an intense discharge of test results, and it might be a bit scattered, but I will put a table of contents in the description for those that want to jump around or go back. And lastly, before we get into the results, I want to thank Camera Canada for supplying me with all these Sigma lenses and adapters. I'm using all EF mount stuff for these tests, but Camera Canada was also kind enough to lend me the MC11 so that we can do some Sony full frame performance tests as well. And they gave me the dock, so all the firmware for the MC11 and the lenses is all updated as of June 2019. Basically, Camera Canada is awesome, and I constantly recommend them to Canadians looking to get Sigma or any other brand's lenses. Alright, so let's start with sharpness. So I did two sets of sharpness tests. The first batch is on the Blackmagic Pocket 4K using the Metabones Speed Booster Ultra, and this way we can see if there's any practical differences in the lenses once the resolution is reduced down to 4K. But then I ran the tests again on the Sony a7 III in photo mode so that we can see if the differences change or increase using the full 6K sensor. Conveniently, the results were pretty much the same on both systems. Now, I'm going to show you some of the samples now, but I can't really show you all of the results because I did each battery of tests 3 times, so I have over 150 sample images, but I will show you the final scores. Alright, so to give you an example of what I did, here in Lightroom is a batch. This is one batch of tests, and like I said, I did this 3 times. And so we can just do a little bit of comparison here. So for each one of these, I've written down the zoom lenses at what focal length they are, and I went through all their focal lengths, and I also went through the apertures from their fastest, but obviously we can only compare certain ones, up to f4 for all of them. But to give you a rough idea of how I evaluated the sharpness, I would compare 2 like configurations. So here we have the Sigma 35mm prime at f2, and we can compare that to the Sigma 18 to 35 at 35, also at f2. And then I would bring them up in a side-by-side like this. I wouldn't know which one was which though, I would do it sort of blind, and then I would make my determinations, and then I would look and see which image was on the left and which image was on the right. These are 4K samples taken from the Blackmagic, screen grabbed out at full resolution from the edit, and then evaluated that way so we can see what the 4K resolution is, because obviously there may be smaller variations than there would be if we had this on, some 40 megapixel camera. That doesn't really count for video that much. But basically I would start by evaluating the center of the frame and seeing how the sharpness was there, and evaluating as it moves across. I would check the corners and see if there's any, distortion and weirdness there. I would check fonts for clarity, look at the colors, and I would go all the way to the edges and see how the fonts rendered out in the edges like that. And then I would make an overall determination of which one was best between those 2 images. So in this case, I would actually say that the one on the left is clearer, contrastier, and sharper for the most part. And even over in the corner, well, in the corner, the one on the right seems to do a little bit better. And I would look over here and say that it's pretty close tie on the film. And Polaroid's pretty much a tie too. It might start favoring the one on the right a little bit. And then I would look and see which one was which. And so the one on the right is the Sigma 18 to 35 at 35mm, and the one on the left is the 35mm prime. And I'll show you one more of those for fun. Let's do the Sigma 24 to 35 at 2.8 and also at 24mm. And let's compare that to the 24mm prime, also at 2.8. And let's zoom in on this right away. And we'll take a look here. And to me, these are actually pretty close. I would say the one on the left seems a little bit contrastier and sharper. Let's jump over down here in the corner. Probably the same thing is true. I'd say the one on the left wins, but these ones are pretty close. And the one on the left, I think, wins there. and again there. So I would say the one on the left is just a little bit better in every way, and I would check and see which is which. So the one on the right is the 24mm prime, and the one on the left is the 24 to 35 at 24 at 2.8. And this was usually surprising to me. I thought when stopped down, I thought that the primes would be sharper all the way across the board, but once you stop down a little bit, I actually found that the zooms were winning, and even wide open, I found that the zooms were winning as well at f2. And so I'll just give you my sort of overall results of each time I did these batches of tests. What you can see here that I have in Excel is that every time I paired two together, I would make one green that was the winner. So you can see that the 24 to 35 at 24 beat the 24 prime. At 35, it tied with the 35 prime. The 18 to 35 at 24 tied the 24. The 18 to 35 at 35 beat the 35. That one was surprising. I just showed you that one. I thought the 35 prime would win there because it's an excellent lens. The 24 to 35 at 24 and the 18 to 35 at 24 tied. And then the 18 to 35 at 35 beat the 24 to 35 at 35. So the 18 to 35 at 35 millimeters is like the sharpest of all these configurations that I checked. And I would go through the different apertures like that. So at f2, for instance, which is the lowest, which is the fastest that all of them can be run on because the slowest lens that we have is an f2. And in that case, the 24s were tied. The 35 actually won at f2 over the zoom. The 18 to 35, however, tied the primes at both 24 and 35 millimeters. And the 18 to 35 beat the 24 to 35 at 24 and 35 for its wide open, and that's because the 18 to 35 was stopped down a little bit. And so when you add all these up for each round, the average was that the 18 to 35 would pull 8 points per round. The 24 to 35 would pull 4 points. The points are based on how many times it got a green box, basically, where it was like, you're the best or you're tied. And then the 35 and 24 primes each got 3 points each. This was surprising to me that the 18 to 35 just kind of pretty much rolled over the other ones in terms of sharpness, and that both zooms beat both primes when stopped down to equal measures that every lens is able to. Now, obviously, there's going to be considerations there that you can get more light in and get faster with the primes, and you're going to have to trade that off. But when equalized, you're not losing anything with the zooms. You're not losing anything by having a zoom. Now let's look at the chromatic aberration and distortion. So here I've got the Sigma 18 to 35, and if we compare that to the 35mm prime, so we're going to see that the 18 to 35, although it can produce sharper results, it does have some stronger distortion issues as you move through the focal range. And these can be seen a lot more strongly here with the way that these lines are kind of warping on the left. And then I also have a brighter light shining on the left-hand side so that we can check for chromatic aberration while we're zoomed in, because I've got these lines blown out. And we can see, however, that the 1835 is performing pretty good for fringing when compared to the prime. It might be a little bit worse than the prime at the same apertures, but it's doing okay. It's on par. The only thing is that it's a little bit more distorted. So a little bit more distorted, but a little bit sharper. Now, if we take a look at the 24 to 35, which I think probably did best in this regard, and we'll compare that to the 35mm prime, we'll see that it doesn't really have the same distortion issues, maybe a slight bit more than the prime, but not as noticeable as the 18 to 35. But the fringing is reduced, I would say, and it also seems to have a more muted color, which is interesting as well. So I would say that the fringing is either as good or better than the prime lens. And this continues on as well when you check out the 24mm. Let's do the 24mm prime against the 24 to 35 at 24. If we zoom in over here, we can see that the 24 prime, which is on the left now, is significantly worse for chromatic aberration than the 24 to 35. And as far as distortion is concerned, I would say that the 24 to 35 is not any worse. If anything, it might be slightly better. So the 24 to 35 basically crushes the 24 in every category that we've checked so far. The 18 to 35 wins in sharpness, but is worse in distortion. The 35mm has a nice kind of like balanced of all of the tests so far, but the 24 to 35 wins in this category. Now, everything we've done so far has been pretty intense pixel peeping, and from a more pragmatic position, you could argue that all of these lenses perform about evenly and excellently, and they would all be pretty great for any purposes that you would throw at them. And that fact also remains true for the flaring test, for which I could barely discern a difference between the four lenses. Now let's talk a bit about focus. The most consistent focuser of the lot is the 24 to 35. I did a series of one-shot AF tests on the Blackmagic and some continuous stuff on the Sony, and the 24 to 35 had the most consistent results. The 24mm was usually the slowest and not as consistent as the 35mm prime, and the 18 to 35mm had the strangest results. It was sometimes the fastest, but it also missed focus more often than the other ones, and it's not parfocal like the 24 to 35mm is. For those of you that don't know, parfocal just means that the lens will remain sharp as you zoom through the ranges rather than changing focus. The 24 to 35mm stays equally sharp regardless of whether you're at 24 or 35mm, but the 18 to 35mm shifts in focus as you zoom through. Now you can actually adjust the rotation of an element inside of the speed booster in order to make the 18 to 35mm parfocal, but doing this will unfortunately make the 24 to 35mm varifocal now. So you can actually only have one lens or the other work perfectly, but in a sense this means that the 18 to 35mm is flawed because the 24 to 35mm was parfocal out of the box, and it was also parfocal on the Sony when I wasn't using the speed booster, where the 18 to 35 is the one that required customization. And if you do make those changes, it could mean that only that lens will now be parfocal and any other zoom lens that you might potentially use in the future won't be because you made those adjustments. But it's still the right thing to do, I would say, if you plan on marrying that speed booster with that lens, and that's just kind of like that combination that you use all the time, or if all your other lenses are primes, then it's still good, and I would recommend making that adjustment because you'd rather have the lens be parfocal. But if you're switching between zooms, then the 18 to 35 is just kind of flawed in this regard. Now when it comes to continuous autofocus, they all perform better than I thought they would. Perhaps the latest firmware for the MC11 helped with this, but for video AF on the Sony, they were all quite good. I put face detection on me on the Sony for like half an hour while I worked, and it didn't lose focus on me once. And I also did the in and out test and the pop-up test, and it was fast and responsive and about as good as I would expect. Maybe those comments were based on people usually using the stuff on the GH4 and GH5, and obviously it's not as reliable on that, but I would say if you set the Sony to fast for the autofocus setting, that these lenses are very usable for video autofocus. The only drawback is that they're a lot louder than a native lens that's, fly-by-wire would be, and it has that gnawing rat sound that might be an issue depending on your recording situation. Now, it is easily defeated by a well-placed microphone and proper levels, but to give you sort of a worst-case scenario, here's what it sounds like recorded using the built-in microphone in the camera. I didn't talk very loudly, so I had to boost everything so you could really hear what this lens sounds like, but with the mic placed away, you're not going to hear it at all. But this is what it sounds like worst case. Now, another consideration when it comes to video is the focus breathing, which is the distance that's sort of traveled by the lens when you focus that almost makes it seem like you're zooming when you shouldn't be. And this is another area where the zooms did surprisingly well and beat the primes in my tests. The 24 to 35mm showed minimal breathing on full frame and was almost non-existent when cropped in on the Blackmagic, and the 18 to 35mm showed excellent performance as well. The primes were significantly worse though, with the 35mm being the worst by far. Now there are some other factors that will likely affect your decision making. First, the 18 to 35mm is an APS-C lens, which means that its image circle won't fully cover the sensor of a full frame camera. So when it comes to versatility, in some ways, it's more limited than the other lenses. When it comes to full frame photography, I found that it wasn't really usable until at least 24mm, but it wasn't good until at least 28mm. But then at 35mm, it was surprisingly excellent and in some ways beat the 35mm prime. Now for 16:9 video modes on the full frame A7 III, the framing is a lot more forgiving, and so the range is a little bit wider, with 24mm looking a lot better for video than it did for photo on the 18 to 35. Now, none of this is an issue if you use this lens on an APS-C or Micro Four Thirds camera, but it is worth considering when we compare it to the 24 to 35mm, which is a full frame and can work on all of the cameras for its full range. But for video purposes, an argument could be made that both of those lenses are 24 to 35mm full-frame video shooters because of the usable range on the 18 to 35. But for photography, I would say you should look at the 18 to 35 more like a 28 to 35mm lens. However, for you photographers, you will find that the vignetting and distortion is easier to correct on the 24 to 35 than it is on the 18 to 35, which requires a lot more tweaking when dealing with that vignetted image circle problem and with some of the distortion problems that we already talked about on the 18 to 35. So if you want a quicker turnaround process, the 24 to 35 is probably better because the automatic corrections are usually good enough. So in those cases, the only real advantage to the 18 to 35 when used for these full frame hybrid purposes would be that extra 1/3 stop of light on the 1.8 versus the f2 on the 24 to 35. But the 24 to 35 has an answer for that as well, because it can be paired with the Speed Booster XL, which is 1/3 of a stop faster than the Speed Booster Ultra. But you can't use the XL, the 0.64 times, on the 18-35 because, again, you'd have those same image circle problems. Now, when it comes to low light performance, the primes definitely win because you're getting up to an extra stop of light when compared to the zooms, but you're trading that extra light for reduced versatility. And there's also physical differences to consider because the primes are obviously much smaller and lighter. And all of these lenses have different front filter thread sizes, with the 35mm taking a 67mm filter, the 18-35 taking a 72mm filter, the 24mm prime taking a 77mm filter, and the 24-35 taking the 82mm filter. Alright, so those are all the facts. Now let's draw some conclusions. To start, the image quality of these lenses is surprisingly even. You can't really go wrong. You can only go faster or zoomier. So it'll really just come down to the purpose of the lens. If you want a lens that you're only going to use for video and probably not full frame video, get the 18-35mm, easy. If you have an APS-C camera and you want to do photo and video, get the 18-35mm. If you shoot full frame, whether exclusively or that's just one of your many systems, I would get the 24-35mm. In fact, despite being a happy owner of the 35mm prime, now that I've done these tests, the only time that I actually recommend the primes is if you know that you're going to want to use one focal length a lot more than you'd ever want to zoom. Because in that case, you can save yourself some weight and get a smaller lens that can do the same job with the added advantage of having up to a stop of extra light. I feel like there's no clear winner here, but there is a clear loser. I like the 24mm prime the least. I would definitely rather have the 24-35mm because the weight doesn't bother me, and if anything, it helps with getting more stable video. And being a stop slower doesn't bother me either because on full frame, I think that f2 is plenty, and on micro four thirds for video, I'll be using a speed booster, so again, f2 should be adequate. And the same applies to the 35mm prime. Again, I'd rather have the 24-35mm, which again, remember, crushes those other two when it comes to focus breathing performance. The harder decision is when comparing it to the 18-35mm, because the 18-35 is a little bit sharper, has a wider range, is a little bit faster, and a little bit lighter and smaller. But it's not naturally parfocal like the 24-35, and I can't use it as comfortably on full frame. But since the usable range of the 18-35 is pretty close to 24-35 when on full frame, and since it's a bit sharper and is probably most commonly used in video, which does have more forgiving framing, and since I can use it as a great 35mm if I need to, I'd say it's the best of the lot. But the 24-35mm with a 0.64 times speed booster is a very, very close second place and definitely my preferred pick when it comes to full frame photography. And for some reason it's actually cheaper right now in Canada than the 18-35mm. Usually the 18-35mm is the cheaper of the two lenses, which is why I would also give it a slight edge over the 24-35, but if you live in Canada, right now you can get the 24-35 for like $300 off. And so in conclusion, and to follow up on the tease that I made in the intro to this video, I've been shooting this entire time on the 18-35mm, and nearly 6 years later, it's still one of the best lenses available for hybrid video shooters. But that's going to be it for me. I hope you found this video helpful or at least entertaining, and if you did, make sure you leave it the old thumbs up and consider subscribing if you haven't already. But if you did not find this video helpful or entertaining, feel free to hit the dislike button twice. Alright, I'm done.